The North Pacific does not forgive. It does not remember. It simply swallows what enters it and moves on, indifferent to the lives it takes, the secrets it keeps, and the families left behind on distant shores waiting for a ship that will never return. In the summer of 1942, somewhere beneath the cold, gray waters off the Alaskan coast, one of America's most promising submarines vanished without a single distress signal, without a witnessed explosion, without a body, without an answer. 70 officers and enlisted men descended into those depths and never came back. For over 6 decades, no one truly knew what happened, and what was eventually discovered would raise more questions than it answered. This is the story of the USS Grunion. To understand what was lost that summer, you first have to understand what was at stake in the Pacific in 1942. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 had shattered American naval confidence almost overnight. Battleships sat crippled or resting on the harbor floor. The strategic balance of the entire Pacific had tilted violently in Japan's favor. The United States needed every weapon it could field, and submarines were among the most critical. Fast, silent, capable of striking convoys and warships from the shadows of the deep, American submarines became the unseen fist of the Pacific War. They hunted in waters where surface vessels could not survive. They carried intelligence, delivered supplies to trapped forces, and sank millions of tons of enemy shipping. They were dangerous, cramped, and essential. And the men who crewed them knew exactly what they were volunteering for. USS Grunion hull designation SS-216 was a Tambor-class submarine commissioned on April 11, 1942. She was fresh from the yards, modern, well-equipped, and assigned to one of the most critical theaters of the early Pacific War. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Manart Lincoln Abeele, a man described by those who knew him as exceptionally capable, technically gifted, and deeply respected by his crew. Abeele had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1930. And by 1942, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of an officer who understood both the mission and its costs. He was 35 years old. He had a wife. He had 3 sons. The crew of Grunion numbered 70 men in total. Most were young. Some were barely out of training. All of them were bound for the Aleutian Islands, a chain of volcanic rock and freezing fog stretching across the top of the Pacific like a crooked spine. The Aleutians in 1942 were not just remote, they were contested. Japanese forces had landed on Attu and Kiska in June of that year, marking the only occupation of American soil during the entire war. The region had become a pressure point, a strategic friction zone where naval assets were being rushed in both directions. Grunion was ordered into those waters to hunt Japanese supply lines and disrupt enemy movements. She departed New London, Connecticut, in late May 1942, arrived at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and was reassigned to patrol duty in the waters around Kiska. What followed in those first weeks was a submarine in battle, operating exactly as intended. Between July 15th and July 30th, Grunion engaged Japanese forces multiple times, filing contact reports that confirmed active combat operations. She sank at least 2 enemy submarine chasers. She was aggressive, precise, and effective. Then, on July 30th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Abeele sent a final message to command reporting that he was running critically low on torpedoes and requesting permission to return to Dutch Harbor. Command approved his return. Grunion turned for home. She never arrived. No further radio transmissions were received. No wreckage surfaced. No life rafts were found. No bodies. The sea offered nothing. The Navy searched the most likely transit routes. They found no trace. On September 22, 1942, the United States Navy officially declared USS Grunion lost. The families of 70 men were notified. The notification letters used careful, formal language that said almost nothing and meant everything. For the families, the silence was a particular kind of suffering. When a ship goes down in a visible engagement, when witnesses survive, when wreckage washes ashore, there is grief. But there is also a shape to that grief. There is something to hold. The families of Grunion had none of that. They had a date. They had a last known position. And they had 60 years of not knowing. Among those families were the 3 sons of Manart Abil. Bruce, Brad, and John Abil grew up knowing their father only through photographs, letters, and the carefully preserved accounts of men who had served alongside him. They knew what he had accomplished. They knew when he had last been heard from, but they did not know where he was. And for Bruce Abil in particular, that question became something more than grief. It became a mission. In the early 2000s, Bruce Abil began coordinating a private search effort. He connected with sonar specialists, maritime researchers, and eventually a company with experience in deep-water search operations. The technology available by the mid-2000s was extraordinary compared to anything that had existed in 1942. Side-scan sonar systems could map the seafloor in resolutions. That would have seemed like science fiction to the men who once searched these waters with limited instruments and fading hope. The search team began methodically sweeping the waters off Kiska, targeting areas consistent with Grunion's last known position and projected return route. In 2006, 64 years after she disappeared, they found her. The wreck of USS Grunion was located at a depth of approximately 1,000 feet in the waters north of Kiska Island. The ROV footage that was eventually captured showed a submarine broken apart on the seafloor, her hull fractured, her bow section separated from the rest of the vessel. The images were haunting in the way that all deep-sea wreck footage is haunting, because the ocean preserves things in ways that time alone never does. Grunion had been down there for over 6 decades, resting in near-freezing darkness, and she was still, in some sense, recognizable. But the discovery raised an immediate and deeply troubling question. What had actually happened to her? The Navy had always listed the cause of loss as undetermined, which in the language of official records means exactly what it says and nothing more. There had been theories over the decades. Enemy action was the most obvious initial assumption, given that Grunion had been operating in waters patrolled by Japanese anti-submarine forces. But the Japanese records that became available after the war contained no confirmed account of a kill matching Grunion's location or timeline. There was no Japanese vessel claiming to have sunk an American submarine in that area on or around August 1942, which meant, if not enemy action, then what? The wreck itself began to tell a story, and the story was deeply unsettling. Analysis of the damage patterns observed on Grunion's hull, combined with research into the specific torpedoes she had been carrying, led investigators toward a theory that no family member wants to hear and no sailor wants to contemplate. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard American submarine torpedo of the early war, was a weapon with a documented and catastrophic flaw. Throughout the early years of the Pacific War, American submariners filed complaint after complaint about torpedo malfunctions. Duds, premature circular runs. A circular run is precisely what it sounds like. A torpedo that, due to a malfunction in its guidance mechanism, fails to travel in a straight line and instead curves back toward the submarine that fired it. The evidence gathered from the wreck site, combined with research by torpedo expert and analyst Al Jacobson, pointed toward this conclusion with a disturbing consistency. It appeared, based on the damage signatures observed on the hull, that Grunion may have been struck by one of her own torpedoes. A weapon she had fired in combat, a weapon designed to kill the enemy, had curved back through the dark water and found her instead. The Mark 14 torpedo's failures were not a secret to naval historians. The weapon had been criticized since the opening months of the war, and its defects were eventually acknowledged and corrected as the conflict progressed. But acknowledging a systematic flaw in a critical weapon system takes time, requires bureaucratic courage. And in the early chaos of a war the United States was losing, that time was not always available. 70 men on USS Grunion may have paid for that delay with their lives. There is a particular kind of tragedy in that conclusion. To be lost to the enemy in battle carries a certain weight of sacrifice, a death with a clear meaning within the logic of war. To be lost to a failure of your own equipment, to be killed by a weapon your country gave you and assured you was reliable, is something else entirely. It is a death that demands a different kind of reckoning. And yet even now, even with the wreck found and the analysis completed, and the theory of a circular torpedo run standing as the most credible explanation available, the word confirmed does not quite apply. The ocean floor is not a crime scene. The evidence is incomplete. The hull is fractured in ways that could be consistent with multiple causes. Some researchers have continued to explore alternative explanations. Others believe the circular run theory is essentially proven by the available evidence. The official cause of loss for USS Grunion remains, in the formal record, undetermined. The families have had to live with that ambiguity. They found the ship. They brought cameras to the darkness and saw what remained of her. They gathered what answers the sea was willing to give, which was not quite enough for closure, but more than 60 years of silence had provided. Bruce Abele, who spent years of his life organizing the search, later spoke about what it meant to find the wreck. Not with triumph, not with resolution, but with something quieter, something closer to the relief of finally being able to say, "She is there, and now we know where she rests." The 70 men aboard USS Grunion remain where they were found. The submarine itself serves as their tomb, and the Navy has designated it as such. No salvage operation will be conducted. No remains will be recovered. The men who sailed from New London in the spring of 1942, who fought in the Aleutian fog and sank enemy vessels and followed their commanding officer into contested waters with professional discipline and personal courage, lie in approximately 1,000 feet of North Pacific cold. They will remain there. There is a broader story woven through the specific tragedy of Grunion, and it is a story about the nature of war itself. The Pacific submarine campaign is remembered in American history as one of the great strategic successes of the Second World War, and by the numbers, that memory is justified. American submarines accounted for an extraordinary percentage of Japanese shipping losses. They disrupted supply lines, denied resources, and contributed materially to Japan's eventual defeat. But the cost was enormous. The United States lost 52 submarines during the war. Approximately 3,500 submariners were killed, representing the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military during the conflict. For every celebrated kill, there were losses like Grunion, losses that went unwitnessed, unexplained, and for decades unresolved. The men who served in those submarines made a specific kind of bargain with uncertainty. They climbed into steel cylinders, descended beneath the surface of contested oceans, and accepted that if something went wrong, there would likely be no rescue, no recovery, no final explanation. They accepted that the sea might simply keep them. Many of those men were 20 years old. Some were younger. They accepted this because they believed in what they were doing. And because when you are 20 years old and your country is at war, believing in what you are doing is often enough. Amanat Lincoln Abele had a different kind of calculation to make. He was a commanding officer, an experienced professional, a man who understood the risks more completely than most of his crew. He knew what the Aleutians were. He knew what the Mark 14 torpedoes critics were saying. He knew that requesting more ammunition meant another engagement, and that every engagement in a submarine was a negotiation with death. He filed his report on July 30, 1942. He turned for home. Whatever happened in the water between that final transmission and the moment Grunion went silent, he faced it as her commanding officer, responsible for the ship and the lives aboard her until there were no more decisions left to make. His sons found him, eventually. Not in the way a son wants to find a father, but they found him. And in the strange, incomplete arithmetic of grief that matters. The wreck of USS Grunion sits on the floor of the North Pacific. The water above her is cold and dark, and the currents move through those depths without any awareness of what lies below. Ships pass overhead, bound for ports in Alaska and across the Pacific, and their crews go about their work without thinking about what the seafloor holds beneath them. The world has moved on in the way that worlds always do, carrying its wars and its losses forward into an ever-receding past. But somewhere in that darkness, there is a submarine. And on that submarine, there are 70 men who went to war in the spring of 1942 and never came home. Their names are on memorials. Their photographs exist in family albums. Their story is now, at least partially, told. The mystery of what exactly happened in those final moments, in the cold and fog off Kiska, will likely never be fully resolved. The sea does not give complete answers. It gives wreckage and evidence, and the haunting geometry of a hole broken on the seafloor. It gives you enough to grieve with, and not quite enough to let go. That, perhaps, is the most honest thing that can be said about USS Grunion and the 70 men who sailed with her. They are found, and they are gone. They are remembered, and they are mystery. They are part of the long, dark ledger of the Pacific War, a ledger written in cold water and silence and the names of ships that went down beneath waves that have long since returned to calm. The North Pacific does not forgive. But perhaps, in finding her, in bearing witness to where she rests, the families of her crew have offered something the ocean never could.